My fiancée tried to destroy my family, one lie at a time. She told my dad I said he was dead to me, told my sister I called her a burden. I believed the distance was natural. Until I read her group chat. Every message started with, "Don't tell him I said this." Victoria had always been charming, the kind of woman who could light up a room with her presence and make everyone feel like they were the most important person in the world. When I proposed to her after 18 months of dating, my family threw us an engagement party that lasted until 3 in the morning. My father Calvin raised toast after toast, declaring that he had finally gained the daughter he never had. My sister Evelyn spent the entire evening planning our bachelor and bachelorette parties, insisting they would be legendary celebrations that would make our wedding week unforgettable. The transformation began so gradually that I attributed it to natural changes in family dynamics. Victoria started volunteering to handle communications with my relatives about wedding details, claiming she wanted to take pressure off my shoulders during the stressful planning period. She would call Calvin to discuss flower arrangements and venue logistics, then return to me with reports about how the conversations had gone smoothly and productively. 6 months later, the warmth had evaporated like morning dew under a scorching sun. The first crack appeared during what should have been a routine Sunday dinner. Calvin, who had never missed one of our weekly family gatherings in 23 years, failed to show up. When I called him, his voice carried a coldness that made my stomach drop and my hands begin trembling with confusion. "Your fiancé told me what you really think about your old man," he said before hanging up abruptly. I stared at the phone, replaying every conversation I had ever had with Victoria about my father. Never once had I spoken negatively about Calvin, a man who had worked double shifts at the steel mill to put me through college and who still called every Tuesday just to check on my life and offer encouragement about work challenges or relationship milestones. Victoria, sitting across from me at the dinner table we had picked out together 6 months earlier, offered a sympathetic smile and suggested that perhaps my father was going through some midlife crisis brought on by the stress of his upcoming retirement. She rubbed my hand gently and assured me that these family conflicts would resolve themselves with time and patience, reminding me that wedding planning often brought out unexpected tensions in families. Evelyn began canceling our coffee dates with increasing frequency, claiming work obligations that seemed to multiply every week like an invasive species taking over a garden. When we did manage to meet, she would fidget with her purse straps and offer short, clipped responses to my questions about her life, her job at the advertising agency, and her recent breakup with her boyfriend of 2 years. The sister who had once called me her best friend and confidant now treated me like an acquaintance she barely tolerated. During one particularly awkward encounter at the bookstore where we used to spend hours browsing together, Evelyn mentioned casually that she understood why I found her so exhausting to be around and emotionally draining to deal with on a regular basis. The comment hit me like a physical blow because I had never expressed such a sentiment to anyone, especially not about the person who had been my closest confidant since childhood and my primary emotional support system after our mother died in a car accident when I was 16 years old. Victoria, who had accompanied me to the bookstore and witnessed the uncomfortable exchange, immediately stepped in to defuse the tension with her characteristic grace and diplomatic skills. She suggested that perhaps Evelyn was projecting her own insecurities onto our relationship, and that sometimes family members grew apart naturally as they entered different life phases and developed new priorities. My mother had passed away when I was 16, leaving Calvin to raise 2 teenagers while managing his grief and his demanding job at the steel mill. Evelyn and I had clung to each other during those dark months, forming a bond that I believed was unbreakable and would survive any challenge that life threw at us. Now that bond seemed to be dissolving without explanation, like salt disappearing in water. The holiday season arrived with all the festive decorations and cheerful music that normally filled me with joy and anticipation. Instead, I found myself eating Christmas dinner with Victoria and her parents while my own family celebrated somewhere across town, without inviting me to join them for the first time in my adult life. Calvin had left a voicemail on Christmas Eve wishing me happy holidays, but explaining that he thought it would be better if we maintained some distance until I figured out how to treat my family with the respect and consideration they deserved after all the sacrifices they had made for my well-being and success. Victoria held my hand throughout the meal with her parents and whispered reassurances that some people never learned how to handle change and growth in relationships. Her parents nodded sympathetically and shared stories about their own family members who had become difficult and unreasonable over the years, particularly during major life transitions like marriages and career changes. The wedding preparations continued around me like an elaborate theater production where I had somehow become a passive observer rather than the leading man. Victoria handled vendor communications, menu selections, and guest list coordination with impressive efficiency and attention to detail that should have filled me with gratitude and relief. Instead, I felt increasingly isolated from the process and disconnected from the family members who should have been sharing in our joy and excitement about the upcoming celebration of our commitment to each other. 3 months into the new year, I decided that accepting the situation without understanding it was driving me toward madness and potentially destroying my mental health in ways that would affect every aspect of my life. The investigation started with a simple question that had been gnawing at my consciousness like a persistent toothache that kept me awake at night. What exactly had Victoria told my father about my supposed feelings toward him? I called Calvin from my office during lunch break, prepared for another cold conversation that would leave me feeling frustrated and confused about the inexplicable deterioration of our relationship. Instead, I asked him directly to repeat what Victoria had shared with him about my alleged complaints and criticisms. His voice cracked as he recounted how my fiancée had called him in tears one evening in November, explaining that I had referred to him as dead to me during a heated argument about wedding planning and guest list decisions. According to Victoria, I had shouted that I wished he would stop interfering in my life and that I was embarrassed by his blue-collar background and worried about how my professional colleagues would perceive him at our wedding reception. The words felt like ice water flooding my veins and paralyzing my ability to think clearly. Never in my entire existence had I harbored such thoughts about Calvin, let alone expressed them to Victoria or anyone else in my social circle or professional network. I told my father the truth with as much conviction and sincerity as I could muster, but he responded with skeptical silence before suggesting that perhaps I had forgotten the conversation due to stress or was trying to cover up my hurtful words to avoid dealing with the consequences of my cruelty toward the man who had sacrificed everything to provide me with opportunities he never had. That evening, I confronted Victoria about the discrepancy between my memory and what she had reported to Calvin about our supposed private conversation. She became defensive immediately, accusing me of calling her a liar and suggesting that I might be experiencing stress-related memory issues from wedding planning pressure combined with work demands and the natural anxiety that comes with major life transitions. She reminded me that she had only been trying to help bridge the gap between father and son by encouraging honest communication and helping Calvin understand my perspective on family dynamics and boundary setting in adult relationships. Her explanation felt rehearsed, like dialogue from a play she had performed many times before for different audiences. I began paying closer attention to every interaction between Victoria and my family members, analyzing conversations and looking for patterns that might explain the mysterious deterioration of relationships that had been strong and healthy for decades. During a chance encounter with Evelyn at the grocery store near her apartment, I managed to extract the details of what Victoria had supposedly relayed about my feelings toward my sister during their phone conversation about bridal shower planning. According to Victoria, I had complained extensively that Evelyn was becoming an emotional burden who demanded too much support and attention from me during her recent breakup, and that I was tired of being her unpaid therapist and emotional caretaker when I needed to focus on my own relationship and career advancement. Again, these were words I had never spoken and feelings I had never experienced toward the sister who had been my closest ally and support system throughout every major challenge and triumph in my adult life. Evelyn listened to my denials with the same skeptical expression that Calvin had worn during our phone conversation, pointing out that Victoria had no apparent reason to fabricate such specific and hurtful statements, and that perhaps I needed to examine my own behavior more honestly and take responsibility for the pain I was causing people who loved me unconditionally. I spent the following week reviewing every interaction I could remember between Victoria and my family members over the past 8 months. She had volunteered to call Calvin about changing our wedding date because I was supposedly too busy with work projects and client deadlines. She had offered to speak with Evelyn about coordinating shower plans because I was apparently stressed about managing too many wedding details while maintaining my professional responsibilities. Each time, Victoria had positioned herself as the helpful intermediary who was trying to facilitate communication and solve problems that were preventing our families from working together harmoniously. Each time, the result had been increased distance and animosity between me and the people I loved most in the world. The pattern was becoming visible, like a hidden image emerging from a puzzle that had seemed random and chaotic, but was actually following a deliberate design created by someone with specific intentions and carefully planned outcomes. I started keeping a notebook where I documented every conversation Victoria had with my family members, recording the stated purpose of each call and the subsequent changes in behavior or attitude that followed these supposedly helpful communications. Victoria kept her phone with religious devotion, never leaving it unattended for more than a few minutes, and treating the device like a sacred object that contained state secrets or classified information. She claimed that her marketing job required constant availability for client emergencies and social media management crises that could explode into public relations disasters if not handled immediately with precision and professional expertise. The device was always face down on surfaces, always password protected with biometric security, always within arm's reach even during intimate moments or relaxed conversations about our future plans and shared dreams. During our 4th anniversary dinner at the Italian restaurant where we had shared our first meal together, and where I had fallen in love with her laugh and her ability to make mundane topics seem fascinating, Victoria excused herself to use the restroom and left her phone on the table between our wine glasses and the flickering candle that cast dancing shadows across the white tablecloth. The screen was still illuminated from a recent message notification that had arrived while she was finishing her tiramisu and telling me about her plans for our honeymoon in Tuscany. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings about privacy violations and trust issues that could destroy our relationship permanently if I crossed this boundary without permission. The desperate part of my mind, the part that was slowly being driven insane by the inexplicable destruction of my family relationships, reached for the phone with trembling fingers that felt disconnected from my conscious decision-making process. The group chat was titled Wedding Planning Warriors and included Victoria along with her 3 closest friends from college. Women I had met numerous times at parties and gatherings, but who had always seemed to share private jokes and references that excluded me from their conversations. I scrolled upward through months of messages, initially seeing normal discussions about dress fittings and venue decorations and catering menus that seemed perfectly innocent and typical of women planning a major celebration together. Then I found the messages that made my world collapse like a house of cards in a hurricane. Victoria had been systematically documenting her manipulation campaign with gleeful precision and clinical detachment that reminded me of a scientist recording experimental results. Every fabricated conversation, every manufactured conflict, every lie she had told to drive wedges between me and my family had been shared with her friends as entertainment and celebrated as victories in some twisted game I had never realized was being played. The messages revealed her strategy with chilling clarity and methodical organization. She wanted to isolate me from my support system before our marriage, ensuring that I would be completely dependent on her for emotional connection and validation, while having no alternative sources of advice or perspective that might interfere with her control over my decisions and behavior. She had researched psychological manipulation techniques online and was implementing them with the methodical approach of a graduate student conducting thesis research. Her friends had cheered her on throughout the process, offering suggestions for new lies to tell and celebrating each successful attempt to create family drama and confusion. They referred to Calvin and Evelyn as obstacles that needed to be removed from my life so that Victoria could have complete control over my emotional landscape and social connections. One friend had suggested telling Calvin that I considered him an embarrassment, while another had recommended convincing Evelyn that I found her needy and exhausting. One message thread documented her plan to escalate the conflicts after our wedding, eventually convincing me to move to another city where my family could not interfere with her complete domination of my social connections and decision-making processes about career choices, financial investments, and future family planning. Another thread revealed her intention to drain my savings account gradually through manufactured emergencies and expensive purchases that she would justify as necessary for our happiness and security, including a detailed timeline for major expenditures that would leave me financially dependent on her income and unable to leave the relationship even if I wanted to escape. The most devastating discovery was a message where Victoria described her technique of always beginning her lies with the phrase, "Don't tell him I said this," when speaking to my family members about my supposed private complaints and criticisms. This approach made her fabricated quotes seem like authentic confidential information that I had shared with her during intimate conversations about my true feelings toward my relatives. Her friends had praised this technique as brilliant psychological manipulation that created believable scenarios while providing Victoria with plausible deniability if anyone questioned the accuracy of her reports about my alleged statements and opinions. I photographed every relevant message with my own phone, my hands shaking so violently that several images came out blurred and had to be retaken multiple times before I could capture clear evidence of the conspiracy that had been destroying my family relationships for months. Victoria returned from the restroom with a bright smile and asked if I had missed her during her brief absence, commenting on how lucky we were to have found each other and how excited she was about spending the rest of our lives building a beautiful future together. I managed to maintain normal conversation for the remainder of the meal, while my internal world underwent complete reconstruction and everything I had believed about my relationship and my fiancé revealed itself to be an elaborate fiction designed to serve her agenda. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent 6 hours preparing for the most important conversation of my life, organizing evidence, and planning an approach that would prevent Victoria from manipulating her way out of accountability for the systematic destruction she had orchestrated. I printed copies of every incriminating message, organized them chronologically, and prepared a detailed timeline of Victoria's manipulation campaign that showed the correlation between her conversations with my family members and the subsequent deterioration of my relationships with Calvin and Evelyn. When Victoria arrived home from her office, she found me sitting at our kitchen table with the evidence spread out like crime scene photographs arranged by a detective preparing to present a case to a jury. Her face went through a fascinating sequence of expressions: confusion about why I was home early, recognition of her own messages displayed across the table, panic about the implications of discovery, and finally cold calculation as she shifted into damage control mode. She attempted to minimize the situation initially, claiming that the messages were exaggerated stories she had shared with friends for entertainment purposes and that everyone embellished their relationship problems when talking to girlfriends about wedding stress and family drama. When that approach failed to convince me, she shifted to claiming that I had driven her to these desperate measures through my emotional unavailability and neglect of her needs during our engagement period, forcing her to seek attention and validation from other sources because I was too focused on work and other priorities. Her final strategy involved tears and promises of therapy and complete reformation of her character, swearing that she would confess everything to my family and spend however long it took to repair the relationships she had damaged through her misguided attempts to protect our relationship from outside interference. I listened to her performance with detached fascination, recognizing the same manipulative techniques that had been documented in her messages to friends and realizing that even this conversation was following a script she had probably used before in other situations where her deception had been discovered. Every word was calculated to produce maximum emotional impact and minimum accountability, designed to make me feel guilty for violating her privacy and responsible for creating the conditions that had forced her to resort to such extreme measures to preserve our relationship. The engagement ring came off her finger and landed on the kitchen table with a metallic clink that seemed to echo through our apartment like a gunshot signaling the end of everything we had built together over nearly 2 years of what I had believed was genuine love and partnership. Victoria moved out that weekend, taking her belongings and leaving behind only the wedding planning materials that would never be needed and the furniture we had chosen together for the home we would never share as husband and wife. I spent the following Monday visiting Calvin at his house and Evelyn at her office, sharing copies of the messages that revealed the truth about Victoria's systematic campaign of lies and manipulation designed to isolate me from my family support system. Both conversations involved tears, apologies, and long embraces that reminded me how much I had missed having family in my life, and how empty the past months had felt without their presence and support during what should have been one of the happiest periods of my life. Calvin admitted that he had sensed something artificial about Victoria's distress during her phone calls, noting that her tears seemed performative and her descriptions of my supposed statements didn't match the son he had raised and known for 28 years. However, he had chosen to believe her because he could not imagine why anyone would fabricate such specific and hurtful stories about someone they claimed to love, and because Victoria had seemed so genuinely upset about the alleged conflicts between us. Evelyn confessed that she had felt manipulated during their conversations, but had dismissed her instincts because she wanted to maintain family peace during wedding planning and didn't want to create additional stress by questioning Victoria's motives or accuracy. The healing process required several months of family therapy sessions where we learned to rebuild trust and communication patterns that had been damaged by Victoria's interference. Dr. Miles, our therapist, explained that Victoria's behavior fit the clinical definition of a narcissistic manipulation campaign designed to isolate romantic partners from their support systems and create dependency relationships that would be difficult to escape. He helped us understand that the damage had been intentional and systematic rather than accidental, which made our recovery process more complex because we had to overcome not just misunderstandings, but deliberate psychological warfare designed to destroy our family bonds. 2 years later, I received a phone call from a man named Dwight who explained that he was engaged to Victoria and had discovered my contact information in her phone records while investigating similar patterns of family conflict that had emerged during their relationship. He had found group chat messages documenting her current manipulation campaign against his family relationships, using nearly identical techniques, and even some of the same fabricated scenarios that she had employed against Calvin and Evelyn during our engagement. Victoria had refined her techniques since our relationship ended, developing more sophisticated methods of creating conflict and maintaining plausible deniability while expanding her manipulation tactics to include financial control and social isolation beyond just family relationships. Dwight and I met for coffee and shared our experiences, comparing notes like detectives working parallel cases and discovering that Victoria had used nearly identical strategies with both of our families, employing the same phrases and manufactured scenarios with only minor variations to account for different personalities and relationship dynamics. We realized that Victoria had developed a systematic approach to relationship manipulation that she could apply to any situation, suggesting that her behavior represented a calculated pattern rather than situational responses to specific relationship problems or stressors. Dwight broke off his engagement after confronting Victoria with evidence of her systematic deception, and 6 months later he called to inform me that Victoria was engaged again, this time to a widower with 2 teenage children who had begun experiencing unexplained conflicts with their father about everything from household rules to college planning decisions. I attempted to contact the man to warn him about Victoria's manipulation techniques, but he dismissed my concerns as the bitter ramblings of jealous ex-fiancés who couldn't accept that Victoria had moved on to healthier relationships with more mature partners who appreciated her loyalty and support. 3 months later, he called me back to apologize and ask for advice about rebuilding relationships with his children after Victoria's lies had nearly destroyed their family bonds and created permanent damage to his reputation as a father and his authority in his own household. The pattern continues to this day, with Victoria moving from relationship to relationship, leaving behind a trail of damaged families and confused victims who struggle to understand how their closest relationships became poisoned by carefully crafted lies designed to serve her agenda of control and domination. Calvin and Evelyn now serve as my early warning system for anyone new I introduce into our family circle, helping me recognize potential manipulation attempts and maintaining open communication channels that cannot be compromised by outside interference or deceptive intermediaries. We have developed protocols for verifying information that comes through third parties and checking directly with each other before accepting reports about private conversations or personal feelings that seem inconsistent with our established relationships and communication patterns. The experience taught me that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who appear most helpful and supportive on the surface, offering solutions to problems they have secretly created while positioning themselves as indispensable allies in manufactured conflicts that serve their hidden agendas for control and manipulation. And that's the story. If you're still here, that means you're one of us. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. I drop new chaos every single day, and trust me, tomorrow's story, it's even worse than this one.